Welcome back to Face the Nation. We're joined now by Brian Deese. He is the director of President Biden's National Economic Council. Good morning and welcome to the broadcast.
Thanks for having me.
You have an incredible challenge on your hands. Yes, the jobless rate is low, but wage growth not keeping pace with inflation. What do you say to Americans who are thinking that they might need a second job to pay their bills?
Well, it is an uncertain moment, and we face real challenges, global challenges. Inflation is a global challenge, 9% in the UK, over 8% in Europe. But we also have real strengths here at home. And so what I would say is we need to navigate through this transition in a way that gets us to stable growth without giving up all of the incredible economic gains that we've made. You mentioned the jobless rate at 3.6%. We've also seen household balance sheets strengthened over the course of this period.
Congressional Budget Office predicts that high inflation will persist until 2024. The Treasury Secretary has said it will stay higher than the originally forecast 4.7%. When does it come down? How much time are you talking about?
Well, prices are unacceptably high right now, and that's why the president has said we need to make this our top economic focus and do everything that we can to get them down. Most independent forecasters, the blue chip, the Federal Reserve, as you say, see inflation beginning to moderate over the course of this year. But our focus is on what are the steps, what are the policies that we can take. And the single most impactful thing that we could do right now is to work with Congress to pass legislation that would lower the costs of things that families are facing right now, like prescription drugs. We could lower the cost of prescription drugs by allowing Medicare to negotiate better prices. That would actually lower federal spending, and it would lower the cost that people pay.
The president said this week in a rare interview that he actually has the votes to do it. Where's the deal? When's the vote?
Well, lowering prescription drug costs is one piece. Lowering utility costs by providing tax incentives for energy is another piece. But equally important, lowering the federal deficit by enacting long overdue tax reform. If we can do a package like that, we can move forward in the near future. It will not only help in lowering prices, but it will send a signal to the markets and the global economy that the United States is really deadly serious about taking on this inflation.
Hiking taxes isn't going to change the price of milk. When and how are you actually putting forward this package?
The package has been debated. It's been worked through.
It failed back when Build Back Better's version of it. So if inflation is the number one priority right now, when are you scheduling a vote to do the things you just laid out?
We're working very closely with congressional leadership, with Senate leadership on that. Senator Schumer is working with his caucus to try to get a final package in place, and we're hopeful that we'll see progress on that in the coming weeks.
So in the coming weeks, you think you can get this done on a party line vote before September?
We're hopeful we can move forward on that and other priorities in Congress as well. There's a bill on semiconductors, which I know you've talked about on this program, computer chips. The lack of affordable and available computer chips has driven up prices across the economy, including in things like automobiles. We're hopeful that we can move that as well before the August recess. That would provide some real relief to the economy as well.
Despite all of what you laid out, and I know the president said recession is not inevitable, it seems increasingly probable. The Conference Board put out their survey this week. It shows 8 out of 10 global CEOs now expect a recession within the next 12 to 18 months. So what power does the president have to stop that kind of contraction?
Well, I think where we are in the economy right now is in a transition. And I spoke to CEOs over the course of the past week from sectors across the economy, and they're figuring out how to navigate this transition. Some of this is exactly what we need to see.
They're planning around a recession.
Well, they're planning around transitions in our economy. People are buying less goods, spending time at home. They're spending more on services. That creates some real challenges for some companies and some CEOs. What I would say is that not only is a recession not inevitable, but I think that a lot of people are underestimating those strengths and the resilience of the American economy.
But shouldn't you level with the American public and just say we are in uncharted waters? I mean, even the Federal Reserve Chair said this week there are things beyond his control. He can't control the price of gasoline. He can't control the war in Europe. He can't control COVID. He has a limited set of tools, and so do you. Is the president powerless here?
Absolutely not. Look, we face unprecedented global circumstances, a global pandemic and a war in Europe that is affecting the global economy. But at the same time, we have a strategy that will make a difference. The legislation that we were talking about, lowering the cost of prescription drugs, lowering the cost of energy, lowering the federal deficit, that would make a real difference.
And you have all 50 Democrats on board for that? Because you didn't last time you tried parts of this bill.
Look, nothing is done until it's done. We're hopeful. We're working hard. We got our head down, and we're going to try to get something done.
So a number of economists, I want to put up a chart of inflation here for our audience to see, measured by the Consumer Price Index. So from the beginning of the pandemic through now, and as you can see, the tick up began a good year before the war in Ukraine began. A number of economists, including at the San Francisco Fed, have said that the tremendous fiscal spending that went underway, the $6 trillion in 2 years, did add to that, including, as you can see right on there, the $2 trillion that the Biden administration pushed through in the spring of 2021. So when people look at that and they say, well, the White House told us that inflation would be transitory. The White House told us we could go through with this kind of spending and we'd be fine, even when Democrats within your own party were warning this would add to inflation. How do you win credibility here to the public and say this time we're not wrong?
Well, you just have to look around the world today to recognize that the two principal drivers of inflation are the pandemic and Putin. We're seeing this everywhere. It is a global phenomenon. As I mentioned, in the UK, inflation's hit 9%.
Right,
in
but
Europe,
the point
it's
is
hit
those
over...
are the things you can't control. I'm talking about the things you can.
Absolutely.
So how do you win that credibility back?
Well, if we look at the things that we can control, we win credibility by taking action. This president is acting. This president galvanized the global community to do a historic release of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, 1 million barrels a day. Leading oil market analysts this week said that action was single-handedly responsible for keeping oil prices from going up even further.
Right,
We're going to take action. We're going to prioritize. We're going to make clear that tackling inflation is our top economic priority.
One of the things that you do have control over at the executive is the approach on tariffs. Treasury Secretary Yellen told me back in November, she acknowledged that the Trump-era China tariffs do add to inflation domestically here. The president was asked about this yesterday and said, we are still in the process of making up my mind. If inflation is the number one priority, why are you dragging out this decision?
Well, I'll let the president's word speak for himself. We're looking closely at it, and I anticipate the president will have more to say on that issue in the coming weeks. But just to be very clear, over the course of the last couple of months, this is an issue about our supply chains and about getting goods to the United States in a way that is effective and cheap. And the president has been incredibly focused on that.
Well, we will continue to track it. Thank you very much, Brian Deese, for coming in.
Thank you.
And we'll be right back. There are just 12 people who get to vote on whether to adjust interest rates and by how much. The members of the Federal Reserve's Open Market Committee. Loretta Mester is one of those people, and she joins us from Philadelphia this morning. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Margaret. Glad to be with you.
Glad to have you back. This sustained high inflation continues to surprise Federal Reserve officials. Jerome Powell, said as much this week, and that's why he said there was this unusually large interest rate increase of 75 basis points. He expects another similar one in another few weeks. What would alter that plan for you?
Well, what we're looking at is trying to get our interest rates up to a more normal level so that we can stem some of the oversized demand momentum in the economy and bring it back down so that we can relieve some of those inflationary pressures. So we're going to be looking for the month-to-month changes in inflation rates to get some really good evidence on whether we've seen inflation first stabilize and then begin to move back down. It is going to take a while to get inflation back down to 2%. But what we're looking for is that we can see some moderation in demand, which has been incredibly strong, bringing it back in alignment with supply side, which, of course, as you know, has been constrained, alleviating some of that price pressures, getting inflation moving back down and on a sustainable path back to 2%, which is our inflation goal. So that's what we're going to be looking at, is what's going on in the monthly numbers. And frankly, the May CPI report basically was bad across the board in terms of we didn't really see inflation stabilize. In fact, some of the measures actually looked worse in May than in April. And so that was part of the calculus of why moving up at a slightly higher than normal rate increase happened at our meeting last week.
Well, one person did dissent, Esther George of the Kansas City Fed. She said she thought the Fed was moving by too much and too fast. She argued significant and abrupt changes can be unsettling to households and small businesses. Why is she wrong? And are you confident these dramatic hikes won't trigger a recession?
Right. Well, I would never say Esther's wrong. It's an alternative view. We had signaled that we thought 50 would be appropriate, but then we got new data. And we've also said that we really need to be nimble in this period of uncertainty. And when we see data moving in the wrong direction or continuing to move in the wrong direction, and information that inflation expectations, not in the short run, but even in the longer run, are moving up, that was what was convincing to me that it was appropriate to move at a bigger clip than we had signaled early on.
And you
But
would expect
again,
that next
really
time?
what we're going to be looking at is demand moderating and coming better in line with supply? And is inflation turning back down? That's going to be key here. We need to see compelling evidence that inflation is beginning to move back down towards our goal.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, you know her from her time when she was running the Federal Reserve. She said this morning the economy will slow. How much are you expecting it to slow? Are you predicting a recession?
So I'm not predicting a recession. If you look at the forecasts that were submitted and released earlier this week of all the participants in the FOMC meeting, you'll see that we do have growth slowing to a little bit below trend growth. And we do have the unemployment rate moving up a little bit. And that's okay, right? It's sort of, we want to see some slowing in demand to get it in better line with supply. But there's other things that are going to be happening later in the year too. For example, we've already seen households really shifting some of their spending rather than spending on goods, which really was the bulk of spending coming out of the pandemic, height of the pandemic, when the economy reopened, into more services. That's going to help alleviate some of the upward pressure on goods prices. So other parts of the economy will be moving as well as what we're doing on interest rates. We've already seen interest rates have an effect in the housing sector, where the housing sector is pulling back from the heights that it had seen. So we want to see some moderation in demand, right? What we're going to be navigating, though, is setting our policy rates, our interest rates, so that we can maintain a healthy economy and healthy labor markets as we go through this period. But there's a lot of uncertainty out there, and we're going to have to be very careful and nimble in how we approach this pulling back of this very accommodative monetary policy that's something more appropriate to the economy.
Right. The Fed chair, though, was pretty clear that there are things that are beyond your control. Monetary policy can't solve this problem. He said gas prices are beyond your control, the war in Ukraine, COVID. So for people at home, does that mean they should assume their food and energy costs are going to stay high for the next year or two?
So I agree with Chair Powell, right? The way monetary policy works is on the demand side of the economy. We can slow some of that demand that's way above where the supply currently is. But we should expect to see some moderation and some improvement on the supply side as we go forward as well. Highly uncertain, I agree. Monetary policy can't control that. What we can do is really do what we can with our tools to get this inflation problem. And as you said, it's at a 40-year high. We've got to get monetary policy in a good place to combat that excessive demand and the excessive demand that really is driving price pressures. That's what we can do with our tools. And we're committed to doing that and keeping inflation, moving it down back to 2%. But the reason it'll take a while is because we need to have that supply side come back into better balance as well. And that's why it isn't going to be immediate that we see 2% inflation. It will take a couple of years, but it'll be moving down.
A couple of years. I mean, the other thing that's hard to measure is just people's confidence, right? And when they look at being told by the administration, by the Fed, that inflation was transitory, they can say, people were wrong, right? The officials got it wrong. Gary Cohn, former president of Goldman Sachs, formerly Trump economic advisor, said the Fed was clearly behind the curve, clearly late in raising rates, and now the runway for a soft landing is now much shorter and narrower. You're not predicting recession, but you've got to acknowledge that there have been missteps and the risk is rising.
Right. The recession risks are going up, partly because monetary policy could have pivoted a little earlier than it did. We're doing that now by moving interest rates up. But of course, there's a lot of other things going on as well. The Ukraine situation, which is a tragedy, right, has really led to that high oil prices that everyone's feeling the brunt of, and high gasoline prices. So other things were moving on the supply side as well. No doubt, supply conditions remain constrained longer than I think anyone thought. The businesses that we talked to in the Cleveland district all thought that there would be meaningful improvement. Even as early as last year, we didn't get that. Now they don't see meaningful improvement until much farther out. So again, other things are going on.
Right.
What I want to say, though, is we at the Fed are very committed to using the tools at our disposal, right, to bring this inflation under control and getting it back to 2%. It is the #1 challenge in the economy now.
It is.
And I believe it's necessary to do that if we want to sustain healthy labor markets. I don't see this as a trade-off at all.
Okay. Well, it's a huge economic challenge and a political one. We'll continue covering it here. Thank you, Loretta Mester. We'll be back in a moment. Today is Juneteenth, a federal holiday marking the abolition of slavery and African-American freedom. June 19th, 1865 was when the last enslaved people in Texas received word of their freedom, more than 2 years after President Abraham Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation. For more, we'd like to turn to CBS News racial justice contributor, Dr. Ibram Kendi, who is also the author of 2 new books, How to Raise an Anti-Racist and Goodnight Racism. Good morning, and happy Father's Day, by the way.
Thank you.
I know you have a 6-year-old daughter, so I wonder, how are you going to teach her what this holiday is?
Well, I'm actually going to teach her that it's Freedom Day, and that throughout this nation's history, there's been 2 perspectives on freedom, really 2 fights for freedom. Enslaved people were fighting for freedom from slavery, and enslavers were fighting for the freedom to enslave. And in many ways, that sort of contrast still exists today. There are people who are fighting for freedom from assault rifles, freedom from poverty, freedom from exploitation. And there are others who are fighting for freedom to exploit, freedom to have guns, freedom to maintain inequality. So I really want to get her to understand that there are multiple kinds of freedom, and she should be fighting for and joining with those who are fighting for freedom from something like slavery.
So this concept gets at sort of the core of what so many of your books are about when you say anti-racist. And I just want to be clear for people who are listening. You do not teach critical race theory or CRT, which has become very politicized. You focus on this idea of anti-racism. How do you explain to people at home the difference? And for those who say this might be too advanced for a child, how do you respond?
Well, the difference is critical race theory is an anti-racist sort of theory, but I'm thinking about something, I'm really trying to get the American people to really understand that there's inequality, and the cause of that inequality is not what's wrong with, let's say, Black people. It's what's wrong with bad policies. And the way kids can understand it is kids understand bad rules. My daughter understands what's not fair. And we can teach children that there's bad rules in society. There are things that are not fair in society, and that's why, let's say, Black people have less. It's not because they are less.
Mm-hmm. So I think for people at home who are trying to understand the concept, it's interesting because you basically are arguing being colorblind is not a virtue. For so long, people were taught, be blind to color. You're saying acknowledging this is important because if you ignore it, it allows racism to survive. Is that right?
It does, and unfortunately, we as parents and teachers and caregivers of children and just, adults want to believe that, but unfortunately, it's just not true. I mean, studies show that as early as 3 years old, our kids have an adult-like concept of race. They're not only seeing color, but they're attaching it to qualities like smartness, like honesty. And so we have to share with our children, yes, there are all these different colors, but they don't mean anything. Just like a book cover doesn't mean anything. You literally have to open the book and you have to open someone's heart to see who they and what they truly are.
You know, Condoleezza Rice, the former Secretary of State, was on this program around this time last year. And I was reading her remarks, and she said when it comes to teaching about race, she wants children to be taught about America's birth defect of racism, but also forward progress on its issues. She said, I don't want this to be black against white, my weaponization of my identity against yours. Do you see that weaponization happening? Because there is fear of that.
I actually think that that weaponization can happen, but that's why, for instance, I talk about the clash between racism and anti-racism, as opposed to black and white. And I also think it's important for us to understand what I call in my work racist progress, how over time, let's take voter suppression policies, have become more sophisticated over time. And so if we're not recognizing both racial progress and racist progress, then we're going to be missing the ways in which racism and why racism is persisting and why inequality is persisting.
You know, one of the things that we are tracking right now in this country is this threat of domestic extremism. And just this week, the 18-year-old white man who killed 10 black people at a supermarket in Buffalo, New York, made an appearance in federal court. He apologized to his parents, but explained his motivation as being about preventing the elimination of the white race. How do parents prevent their child from being radicalized like that? I mean, that sounds like online recruitment for terrorism or something.
It is, and that's a huge, huge problem. I mean, the number of particularly white male teens who are being recruited in multiplayer video games, online, through memes, through direct messages, you know, is really high. And the way that we protect our kids from that is ensure they can identify white supremacist ideology. And the way they can identify white supremacist ideology is to teach them about it. There's no way they're going to be able to protect themselves from it. Just like they can't protect themselves from cars. They have to understand to look both ways, whether they're teenagers or young people, so they won't get harmed.
Dr. Kendi, thank you very much. Good luck with the books. And happy Father's Day again.
Thank you.
We'll be right back. That's it for us today. Thank you all for watching. And a reminder that you can set your DVR if you can't watch the full show. And to all the dads out there, including my dad, my father-in-law, and my husband, happy Father's Day. Until next week, for Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.